So in this video, we're going to come around and we're going to talk about who John was, what the uniqueness of his gospel was, what the purpose of the gospel was. But I want you to stay tuned for this entire video because I'm going to show you how you can use the gospel of John to prove that Jesus Christ indeed is God. Okay, so the first question we want to ask and answer is who actually wrote the gospel of John? Well, that would be John. But the problem is there are several different Johns in the New Testament. So the one that wrote this one is John, who was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ. He was actually one of the inner three, along with Peter and James, who was kind of like the inner circle with Jesus. But more specifically, if you ask John, John was Jesus' favorite disciple because he called himself the one whom Jesus loved. John also wrote 4 other books in the New Testament, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and also the book of Revelation as well. Okay, so the second question we want to answer is what was the purpose of John's gospel? And it's important as you're studying through the gospels to understand that each gospel was written for a specific purpose to a different group of people. Now, if you really want to understand why we have 4 gospels and the specific differences between these 4 gospels, I have another video on this channel where I talk about that. I'm going to put a link in the description box below and a card somewhere up here on the screen. But specifically, John tells us what his purpose was for writing the gospel. He says in verse 30, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John does not leave it up for us to figure out why he is actually writing his gospel. He says, I'm writing this so that you will believe that Jesus indeed is God. Now, how he does this is genius. He actually organizes his gospel around 7 what are called I am statements, and then 7 signs that Jesus performed in his earthly ministry. And these 7 I am statements prove that Jesus is God based on his words, whereas the 7 signs in the Gospel of John, or miracles if you will, prove that Jesus indeed is God by his works. So when you combine his words and his works together, this is proof that Jesus indeed is God, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video. Now let's talk about some of the unique features of the Gospel of John. Well, you may be interested to know that 93% of the Gospel of John is actually unique to John, which means it's not found in any of the other 3 Gospels. Also, interestingly, only 2 events before the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus Christ are actually found in other Gospels, specifically him feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. The third thing that makes John unique is that John focuses quite a bit on Jesus' private ministry, whereas the other 3 Gospels focus more on Jesus' public ministry. So you have these little snapshots or interviews where Jesus spent private time with people like Nicodemus, or the woman at the well in John chapter 4, or his disciples in John chapter 13 through 17, or Mary and Martha, or also a private conversation that he had with the apostle Peter in John chapter 21. And finally, there are no parables, not a single parable that is found in the Gospel of John, which makes this unique as compared to the other 3 Gospels. Okay, so now let's get into the good stuff. As I said earlier, John is going to prove that Jesus is God based on 7 I am statements and then 7 signs or miracles that he performed. So let's start with the 7 statements that Jesus said. 7 times throughout the book of John, Jesus says, I am, and then he finishes by saying, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the gate, I am the door, so on and so forth. Now, why is this important? Well, if you go back to the Old Testament, when Moses asked God and said, who should I tell them has sent me? God says, you just tell them that I am has sent me. And so the words I am actually became a title for God, meaning the self-existing one, hence the name I am. So why is this important? Because all through the Gospels, whenever Jesus says, I am, they understood that Jesus, by saying I am, referencing back to the Old Testament, was essentially making himself equal with God, which is the reason why they called him a blasphemer, which is the reason why he had so much hostility and animosity with the religious leaders of his day. And finally, not only did Jesus prove that he was God through his words, but even more importantly, he proved that he was God by his works. So John now, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, highlights 7 miracles or signs that Jesus performed in his earthly ministry to prove that if Jesus can do these things that only God can do, well, that means that Jesus himself must be God. And each one of these signs highlight a different aspect or character of his divine nature. The first sign is when Jesus turned water into wine, highlighting his power over the chemical process of nature. Only God can change a substance from water into wine. The second sign was whenever Jesus healed a nobleman's son. Now, the reason why this sign is important is because Jesus basically just spoke a word and said, hey, I don't even have to be present. I don't even have to go into your home and heal your son. I'm just going to speak a word, and by me speaking a word, your son is going to be healed. In that day, for someone to even attempt to heal someone else, they would have to be physically present at this person's home, and even then, it was nearly impossible for them to do it. Now, Jesus demonstrates his power over distance by speaking a word, and his man's son was healed. The third miracle was when Jesus healed this man who had been lame for 38 years, and this highlighted the power that Jesus had over time. He said, hey, even though your situation has been stuck and it's been the same way for 38 years, I am not limited by time. I can change your situation even though you've been stuck in a bad situation for a very long time. The fourth sign is probably one of the most commonly known ones, and that was when Jesus fed 5,000 men plus some women and children with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And so this demonstrates Jesus' power to create things out of nothing. This points back to the creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Men have to use something to create something else, but only God is able to actually speak something into existence and create something out of nothing. The fifth sign was when Jesus walked on water, and this demonstrated Jesus' power over nature. Nature says it's impossible to defy gravity and walk on water, and Jesus says, hey, that may be impossible for man, but because I am the Son of God, I am able to defy gravity and I have power over nature. The sixth sign was when Jesus healed a man who was born blind, and this just demonstrates Jesus' power over sickness. It demonstrates that there is no defect, there is no disease, there is no sickness that is too great for Jesus to heal. And then the seventh sign is whenever Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and this goes without saying, this proves that Jesus has power over death. No human being can raise or resurrect somebody from the dead and give them new life. In the same way, if Jesus can do this along with these other signs, my friend, it is proof that Jesus is not just a man, he's not just some prophet, he was not just some good teacher. Jesus is the Son of God. So the next time you read the Gospel of John, hopefully you'll pay a little bit closer attention to the 7 I am statements, or the words that Jesus spoke that proved he was God, and also the 7 signs that are highlighted in the Gospel of John, which are his works that also prove that he is God, so that you yourself will not only be able to share this with other people and show them that Jesus is God, but you'll be more convinced in your own mind that Jesus indeed is God himself.